Okay, so what is ABA? ABA is applied behavior analysis and is a scientific approach to understand behavior. They use the ideas and principles of respondent and operant conditioning, and we like to focus on socially significant behaviors and change and shape those behaviors so that children can navigate the world around them. It's complex and it requires data and lots of training. And so if you think that you have a client or you know of a kiddo that can benefit from it, you would need to discuss those options with the family and a BCBA. It's not something to just make decisions of without the knowledge of those individuals.
All right, let's talk a little bit about what is behavior. Behavior is what living organisms say or do, and it implies an action. So we want to be able to make sure we can see that. So an example for this is, let's say a peer took a toy away from your client, and your client engaged in crying. Okay, so we have two behaviors here. We have the peer taking a toy, and then we have the client engaging in the crying behavior. So we want to avoid labels, conditions, states such as anxious, hungry, sad, or happy, because those are things that are really, they can't be seen. So when we think of behavior, we want to think verbs. Okay, what can we see? Okay, so this is a little chart here. We have a column for behavior, and then we have a column for not a behavior. So behaviors are things like smiling, eating, pacing, crying. Those things that are not a behavior would be happy, hungry, anxious, depressed, okay? Because we can't see those. We can't see them, so we aren't able to track that. We want to make sure it's observable so we can be able to measure it.
In ABA training, we always talk about the dead man's test, which helps us to define a behavior. Basically, if a dead man cannot do it, then it's not a behavior. Or yeah, and if a dead man can't do it, it is a behavior. Like if the wind blows something over, the action of falling over is not a behavior. But if you're like moving, waving, like saying things, those are all behavior examples. So as we mentioned before, ABA is based off of the principles of respondent conditioning and operant conditioning. So we wanted to go in and further explain those. So respondent conditioning involves teaching a response to a neutral stimulus or something that happens that's neutral or an object that's neutral by like connecting it to something that's naturally occurring and does produce a response. So a lot of people know of the experiment with Pavlov's dog, where he starts salivating when he saw a food, and so they began ringing a bell every time the dog is presented with the food. So that way the dog starts salivating with the sound of the bell, even though they fade out that food and the food is no longer being presented. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is teaching a voluntary response by associating it with a reward or something that's aversive. So B.F. Skinner is like the big guy in our field, and his experiment was putting a rat in the box and conditioning that rat to press a lever to get food. And so it happens at the beginning by the rat just pressing it by mistake. But as he's starting to connect, like, I'm getting food when this happens, he's pressing the lever more and more in order to get that food.
I want to extend on that too, Jordan. The operant conditioning, when we think of operant conditioning, it's a good thing to think of consequences. So your behavior is more likely to occur based on your history of consequences.
Yeah, definitely. And there are, yeah, I don't think so. There it is. So here's a video about those two topics.
When we think about learning, we often picture students in a classroom or lecture hall, books open on their desk, listening intently to a teacher or professor in the front of the room. But in psychology, learning means something else. To psychologists, learning is a long-term change in behavior that's based on experience. Two of the main types of learning are called classical conditioning and operant or instrumental conditioning. Let's talk about classical conditioning first. In the 1890s, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov did some really famous experiments on dogs. He showed dogs some food and rang a bell at the same time. After a while, the dogs would associate the bell with the food. They would learn that when they heard the bell, they would get fed. Eventually, just ringing the bell made the dogs salivate. They learned to expect food at the sound of a bell. You see, under normal conditions, the sight and smell of food causes a dog to salivate. We call the food an unconditioned stimulus, and we call salivation an unconditioned response. Nobody trains a dog to salivate over some steak. However, when we pair an unconditioned stimulus like food with something that was previously neutral, like the sound of a bell, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so classical conditioning was discovered. We see how this works with animals, but how does it work with humans? In exactly the same way. Let's say that one day you go to the doctor to get a shot. She says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit," and then gives you the most painful shot you've ever had. A few weeks later, you go to the dentist for a checkup. He starts to put a mirror in your mouth to examine your teeth, and he says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit." Even though you know the mirror won't hurt, you jump out of the chair and run screaming from the room. When you went to get a shot, the words, "this won't hurt a bit," became a conditioned stimulus when they were paired with the pain of the shot, the unconditioned stimulus, which was followed by your conditioned response of getting the heck out of there. Classical conditioning in action. Operant conditioning explains how consequences lead to changes in voluntary behavior. So how does operant conditioning work? There are two main components in operant conditioning: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcers make it more likely that you'll do something again, while punishers make it less likely. Reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but this doesn't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of a stimulus, like getting dessert after you finish your veggies, and negative means the removal of a stimulus, like getting a night of no homework because you did well on an exam. Let's look at an example of operant conditioning. After eating dinner with your family, you clear the table and wash the dishes. When you're done, your mom gives you a big hug and says, "Thank you for helping me." In this situation, your mom's response is positive reinforcement if it makes you more likely to repeat the operant response, which is to clear the table and wash the dishes. Operant conditioning is everywhere in our daily lives. There aren't many things we do that haven't been influenced at some point by operant conditioning. We even see operant conditioning in some extraordinary situations. One group of scientists showed the power of operant conditioning by teaching pigeons to be art connoisseurs. Using food as a positive reinforcer, scientists have taught pigeons to select paintings by Monet over those by Picasso. When showed works of other artists, scientists observed stimulus generalization as the pigeons chose the Impressionists over the Cubists. Maybe next they'll condition the pigeons to paint their own masterpieces.
So let's talk a little bit about reinforcement. So there are two types of reinforcement. Okay, so in ABA, reinforcement occurs when a behavior increases after there's a presentation or removal of a stimulus. Okay, so we have positive and negative reinforcement. When we think of reinforcement, we are adding something to this. So positive reinforcement occurs when the stimulus is presented, causing the increase in a behavior. Okay, so here's an example as far as a toddler voids on the potty and gets an M&M. In the future, they're likely to go again on the potty because they're more motivated to get that M&M. A negative reinforcement is different from positive reinforcement. Okay, so it occurs when the stimulus is removed, causing the increase in a behavior. So with reinforcement, we're thinking of increase in behavior. So let's say perfect time for summer, using sunscreen before going to the pool. Okay, so the potential sunburn is removed. So you're more likely to use and keep using that sunscreen in the future to avoid the sunburns.
We wanted to take a moment here to talk about exactly what a stimulus is. And so it's an object or event which follows a response that will increase or, in terms of punishment, decrease the likelihood that the same response will occur again. So basically, it always evokes a specific reaction or causes something else to happen, or what influences the behavior. So if someone rings your doorbell at home and you answer the door, then that doorbell sound would be a stimulus. Or if you get a notification on your phone, that notification is a stimulus saying there's a two drinks for 50% off at Starbucks. You're gonna go and go to Starbucks for your coffee.
Okay, so we talked about reinforcement a little bit. Now I want to talk about punishment. Punishment gets a bad rep, but I want to talk a little bit about that. So in ABA, punishment occurs when a behavior decreases after a stimulus is presented or removed. Okay, so we want that behavior to decrease in regards to punishment. So we have two types of punishment. We have positive punishment and we have negative punishment. Positive punishment occurs when the stimulus is presented and the behavior decreases. So we're looking at the behavior decreasing when we're talking about punishment. So for example, I don't know if anyone's gotten a speeding ticket. You get a speeding ticket after you're driving too fast. Okay, so you now have to pay this hefty fine. You're super frustrated about it. You are less likely to speed in the future after you receive that ticket. At least I would hope so. So now negative punishment occurs when the stimulus is removed and the behavior decreases. Once again, that behavior is decreasing. So here is a good example is a student is pouring paint on the floor at an art center. So the teacher removes them from the center. The student is less likely to pour the paint after losing the opportunity to participate in art. So the teacher is removing them from the center. So hopefully in the future, the student is less likely to pour the paint on the floor after losing this opportunity. So here's just a little bit of a breakdown. It's easier to see it in a chart form. We have positive and negative reinforcement and punishment in this chart. So punishment, you're adding aversive stimulus to decrease the behavior. That is positive punishment. Positive reinforcement, you're adding a pleasant stimulus to increase or maintain that behavior. Now we're talking about negative reinforcement. You're removing the aversive stimulus to increase and maintain the behavior. And negative punishment is you're removing the pleasant stimulus to decrease the behavior. So we're thinking punishment, we're decreasing the behavior. Reinforcement, we're maintaining and increasing the behavior.
So all of these kind of correspond to the same thing, which is motivation. Everything that we do is based off of the motivation of the learner. And so motivating operations are events that will either encourage or prevent behaviors. For things that will encourage behavior, we use establishing operations. So if a client is deprived of something or has an aversive response to something, then a reinforcer's value is going to go up. So if you skip breakfast, you're going to work really hard and really fast to be able to take an early lunch because you're hungry. Whereas an abolishing operations occur when you're satiated or you're in a mindset where the value of a reinforcer is not as powerful. And so if you eat a really, really big breakfast, you're going to probably work slower because you're not really working towards lunch. You don't have a rush to get out the door so you can make it to that point of reward for the lunch.
All right, this is one of my favorite topics when it comes to ABA are the functions of behavior. So an important part, this is a very important part of ABA, okay, because in determining the function of individuals' behavior, or rather why they are doing the things that they are doing. The same behavior can serve different functions. That's why it is really important to take ABC data, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They can serve different functions depending on the learner and the setting and the motivation. So there are moments where you can actually be reinforcing a behavior inadvertently. So here's a good example is client begins to throw crayons when you say it's time to color. So you reprimand them, say, no, don't throw the crayons. And you continue to place the demand that they should finish coloring. Yet they continue to throw the crayons in the future and you continue to reprimand. This function of this behavior may not be to avoid the demand, but rather to gain attention. So actually, yes, by reprimanding them, as we're always thinking, yes, a reprimand, they're going to listen to what we're saying. Do not do that. Do not do that. That can actually be attention maintaining you can actually be maintaining the behavior by giving them attention. So you reinforce the behavior and you are going to see it continue. So these are the functions of ABA. We have escape avoidance, attention, access to tangibles, and automatic. So these functions, let's talk a little bit about those. For escape and avoidance, the behavior is occurring as a method to discontinue an activity, okay? So if your client is trying to avoid table work, they may start flopping to the floor, crying, and engaging in those inappropriate behaviors. So in order to reduce this function, we could reduce by blocking the escape and having the learner complete the task. Which can be broken down into smaller task pieces to ensure escape is blocked and obtained by on adult basis. So the second one here is attention, which we kind of talked about briefly in the last example, is the behavior is occurring to attract the attention of others. Okay, we can do this by ignoring the behavior and only giving attention to the preferred behavior or the more appropriate behavior. Okay, so we're not going to provide a great deal of attention when it comes to crying or flopping to the floor, those types of negative behaviors. The next one is access to tangibles. So this could be a toy, food, something that's motivating to the client, and they really love it so much. The behavior is occurring to obtain something that is desired. So we can reduce this by withholding the item until the preferred behavior is provided. We want to be careful not to, if the client is crying, engaging in self-interest behaviors, we want to be sure not to give them that tangible item because it could reinforce those behaviors to happen in the future. And the last one is automatic, also known as sensory stimulation. The behavior is occurring because it just might feel good to the client. And we can reduce this by replacing behavior with safer alternative behaviors. This could be an example, a hand flapping in children with autism by giving them maybe something to hold to reduce that hand flapping, something incompatible.
So everything, all of our decisions are based on the ABCs of behavior. And we're trying to figure out how to navigate or treat a behavior by figuring out why it's happening. And so we take what we call ABC data, where we record the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So the antecedent would be anything that occurs before the behavior, whether it's maybe a sound or maybe they have access to an object that may have caused the behavior to occur. The actual behavior is exactly what happens. So we're not just talking about like the general terms. We're saying this child started to scream. This child fell to the floor. And we're being really specific about what happened. And then the consequence would be what happened after the behavior. And a lot of times this is going to be based off of like the reaction that they got. And like what maybe the adult did, what peers around them did, what happened as a direct correlation of that behavior occurring. So in a non-clinical example, if your watch comes off and falls into the pool, that would be the antecedent. You losing your watch is the thing that happened right before the behavior, which is jumping into the pool. And because you jumped into the pool, you got your watch, and everyone was like, yes, you did it. You saved your watch. It's not going to die. You don't have to buy a new one. Like, that's awesome. And that would be the consequence. All right. And that's our presentation.